My name is Elijah Gray, and I'm 34 years old. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, though I never felt like I truly belonged to the city or to anyone around me. Growing up, I spent most of my time in the quiet corners of classrooms, in the shadow of my own reflection. I had vitiligo, a condition that gradually lightened my skin in patches across my face, hands, and arms, leaving an uneven, almost patchwork-like appearance. I've lived with it for as long as I can remember, and I've never gotten used to the way people look at me when they think I'm not paying attention. I used to believe the world could ignore me, but no one can ignore a face like mine. Not for long. When I started at my current company, I was told I'd fit in fine, that they were a diverse team. They even called it innovative, this company. I was the one they claimed would bring a fresh perspective. What they didn't mention was the unspoken rule about what fresh should look like. Fresh, they meant, should look polished, confident, and clean-cut, not marked by patches of pale skin that didn't belong to any one shade, not a face that turned heads in meetings because no one had ever seen it before. And then there was Greg Thompson, the boss. He was the kind of person who thought the world operated the way he saw it, the one who would pick the loudest voice in the room, the flashiest idea, the one that looked the most confident. His sharp suits and polished shoes never seemed to match the sharpness of his attitude, though. Greg liked control. He liked to keep people in line, and his line was narrow. He was quick to pass judgment on anyone who didn't fit his mold. I'd seen him do it with other employees, smaller things, a comment on their hair, a remark about their clothes, but when it came to me, it was different. He didn't just comment. He made it clear. His face never hid it. He didn't have to speak. His eyes told you everything. One morning in a meeting, the tension thick in the room, Greg turned to me without warning. "Elijah, I've been thinking," he started, his voice steady but full of a kind of calculated calm, "with your, look, I'm just not sure you're the right fit for the face of this campaign. It's a branding thing. You know what I mean? Clients need someone more conventional, someone they don't have to explain." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him. Not in anger, not in disappointment, just silence. I knew exactly what he was saying. He was making it clear, again, that my face was a liability, that my skin wasn't marketable, that I wasn't the right fit. Not for the clients, not for the company. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it. I'd heard it my entire life, and in some ways I had learned to ignore it, or at least pretend to. I nodded, acknowledging his comment, but said nothing. The room was silent. For a moment, I could feel the eyes in the room shift to me, but I didn't flinch. I just kept my hands folded on the table, still and controlled. No one said anything else. The meeting moved on, but I could feel the invisible weight of his words hanging in the air. After the meeting, I left for the restroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. The same face I'd seen countless times. The same skin, blotched with patterns of white that some people couldn't ignore. I ran my fingers over the spots on my cheek and the marks on my hands. People always looked past the eyes, past the smile. They focused on the skin. And Greg? He'd never be the last to judge me that way. He wasn't the first either. But as I stood there, looking at myself, I realized I didn't care anymore. This face? This skin? It had survived too many stares to let one more person's narrow perception define me. In the following weeks, I kept my distance from Greg, but I kept working. Hard. I knew I had to prove myself in ways that had nothing to do with my appearance. I buried myself in numbers, in projects, in results. I made myself undeniable. I wasn't going to let someone else decide what I could do, what I could offer. If I was going to be the one who had to prove myself, then I would. I would do the work. Not the talking, not the explanations, just the work. Clients came and went. Some looked past me, as expected. But one didn't. One client came into the office and asked for me directly. I didn't know who he was at first. His suit was simple, his tie unremarkable, but his presence filled the room. He didn't look at me with hesitation or discomfort. He looked at me like he was seeing someone who could get things done. He didn't mention my face. He didn't even mention the vitiligo. He looked at me like I had the answers, like I was the one who could deliver. And when the deal was done, when the ink was dry on the contracts, he didn't thank Greg. He thanked me, not for what I looked like, but for what I could do. And just like that, Greg had become irrelevant. I knew what was happening. It wasn't just about the client. It wasn't just about the deal. It was about everything that had been quietly building under the surface, the quiet strength that comes from years of being overlooked, underestimated, ignored. People only see what they want to see, but they always miss the most important part. And now, in that moment, the only thing anyone could see was the result. I had earned my place not by changing what I looked like, but by changing what I did. The client was mine. And Greg? He was still looking for someone who could fit the mold, but he wasn't going to find them in me, and he certainly wasn't going to find them in the mirror. The days blurred together, each one a quiet testament to what I was becoming. A part of me always expected it would be like this, that the work would define me in the end, that the skin I wore would eventually fade into the background of something bigger. But it was harder than I thought. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror, watching the familiar patches of white skin spread across my face, marking me in ways I couldn't erase. Every time I stepped out of the apartment, I could feel the world's eyes on me, those subtle glances that lingered a little too long, as though they were trying to decide whether I was worth their attention. But I couldn't be weak. I couldn't be the man who flinched. At work, the tension in the air grew heavier with every passing day. I was careful to keep my head down, to stay in my lane, but it didn't help that I could feel Greg's eyes on me more often, the way he would glance at my face, then look away just as quickly like he had caught himself. I knew what it meant. I'd been around long enough to understand the rhythm of these unspoken things. He wasn't just uncomfortable. With me, he was afraid that someone might see me as more than just a face that didn't fit. The problem was that I didn't know how to prove him wrong. He had set the rules, and I wasn't the kind of person who went around challenging authority. I had always believed that if you did the work and stayed out of the spotlight, the world would eventually have no choice but to acknowledge you. But Greg had made it clear. Some people would never see me. Not truly. One afternoon, after another pointless meeting where Greg spoke for what felt like hours, I found myself walking down the hallway. The glass doors at the end of the corridor reflected my face back at me in an almost jarring way. I couldn't help but stop for a moment and look. Not in vanity, not in insecurity, but out of curiosity. The reflection was almost foreign to me at that moment. A face that wasn't what I wanted to see, but what the world wanted me to hide. The skin was patchy, uneven, like the canvas of someone who wasn't supposed to belong to the corporate world. It felt like I was standing outside myself, looking in. I could see how the world might see me. Broken, incomplete, not fitting the picture. But there was something else there too. Something that I had never fully allowed myself to embrace. The more I looked at myself in the reflection, the more I realized how much I had allowed others to define my value based on something so superficial. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't broken. I was just different. And if they couldn't see it, then it wasn't my problem. As I stood there, I noticed how the light played across my face, the contrast between the dark skin around my eyes and the pale patches on my cheek. The reflection became less a symbol of what I was missing and more a story of what had been added to me over the years. Every mark, every patch of lighter skin was a part of the history I had lived through. It was a map of survival, not shame. I had carried this face through every door, every meeting, every moment of doubt, and I hadn't collapsed under it. It was funny how much I had let my appearance shape my actions, my interactions, my decisions. I had avoided being seen because I was terrified of how others would perceive me. I kept my distance, kept my head low, trying not to draw attention to the very thing I couldn't change. But as I stood there, looking at myself in the glass, I realized something crucial. I had been the one hiding, not the world. I had allowed the fear to control me for far too long, and now it was time to stop. The reflection in the glass wasn't just my face anymore. It was everything I had overcome. It was strength, resilience, and, most of all, truth. This wasn't a face that needed to be fixed or hidden. It was a face that had survived the world's indifference and its judgments and still stood tall. In that moment, the weight of it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like power. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was claiming my space in the world. I left the hallway and walked back to my desk. The rest of the day passed like any other. Meetings, reports, calls, but I felt different. I had finally seen myself, truly seen myself, for the first time in years. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was simply moving forward, quietly, without the need for anyone's approval. Next time Greg looked at me across the conference table, I didn't look away. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see the discomfort in his gaze. I saw something else, a flicker of something he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet, but something that was there, just beneath the surface. I didn't need to confront him. The reflection had already done the work for me. Days passed, and the quiet shift in the office continued. No one spoke about Greg's absence. No one questioned why he hadn't returned, why things seemed to have settled without him. But there was a subtle change that I couldn't ignore. People started coming to me more often, not for socializing or small talk, but for help. Small questions at first, just clarifications about reports, a second pair of eyes on a project. It wasn't anything grand. It was never a grand gesture. It was the simple, steady work that I had always done, but now with eyes that were a little more focused, a little more attentive. I noticed it most during team meetings. There had been a time when I would speak, when I would contribute my thoughts and ideas, and Greg's gaze would flicker past me, not out of rudeness, but from his need to control the room, to keep it his own. The others would listen, but his influence was always there, hovering just above every word. Now the space felt different. People were listening, not just to the sound of words, but to the substance behind them. When I spoke, it wasn't just because I was filling in the silence. It was because my words held weight. No one was brushing past me anymore. They were looking for answers in the numbers, in the results. I still didn't have a business card. I didn't need one. It had always felt unnecessary to me, an artifact of an outdated hierarchy, a symbol of the visible face behind the company. I had never needed one to prove my worth. I had always known that numbers spoke louder than titles, louder than a name on a card or a suit that fit just right. Every report I submitted, every calculation I double-checked, every project I reviewed, they spoke for me. When the quarterly projections came in, I had already anticipated the numbers. I knew exactly where we were, what we were missing, where the company could either recover or slide into stagnation. Greg had always taken the lead on these reports, presenting them as if they were his own work, his own triumph. But it wasn't. His work. It never had been. It was the result of months of decisions I had made, of work I had done quietly, without the spotlight, without recognition. I had never asked for credit, never demanded acknowledgement. But now, when the results came in, there was no escaping it. I had built them, not Greg. I presented the numbers in the next board meeting. I didn't look at the others at first, didn't search for their reactions. I just delivered the facts, laid them out in a way that was clear and indisputable. I knew the trends, the charts, the graphs, and I knew how to make them sing. There were no distractions, no theatrics, just the work. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, not because they were shocked, but because the data was irrefutable. No one could argue with what I had presented. No one could claim credit for it. Not Greg, not anyone else, just the numbers. I watched as the board members flipped through the slides, murmuring to each other, comparing the projections against what had been expected. One by one, they started nodding, making their own calculations, realizing that the path forward was already laid out. They didn't need to ask for approval. The truth was clear in front of them. I had built it, and I had done it without a business card, without fanfare. I had built it with the kind of consistency that doesn't rely on titles or recognition, but on quiet, unshakable focus. When the meeting adjourned, no one stood up immediately. They all just sat there, waiting. I could feel the shift, the subtle acknowledgement that had been absent before. I hadn't earned it with charm or by speaking louder than anyone else. I had earned it with results, with an understanding that had been built through long hours of patience and quiet determination. They had no choice now but to recognize it. It was a slow change, but it was one I could feel. People started to seek me out, not because they were forced to, but because they recognized that I had answers. They wanted to know what I thought. They didn't ask about my face, about the skin that made them uncomfortable before. They asked about the work, the numbers, the decisions, and I continued to deliver, because that was all I had ever needed to do, to prove myself not with what I looked like, not with what anyone else wanted to see, but with the work that spoke for itself. That's what mattered in the end. Not the business card, not the title, just the work. And it was enough. The meeting was set for 10:30. I had been told, through a long string of emails and unspoken assumptions, that it was going to be one of those routine check-ins, another opportunity for Greg to parade his so-called achievements, to sit at the head of the table and steer the conversation in whatever direction suited him that day. But something felt different. The way people spoke about the client, the way their eyes kept glancing toward me, almost as if they were waiting for a signal I hadn't given yet. I sat at the back of the room, as usual, near the windows where the light was dimmer. No one ever asked me to sit there, but I never felt like standing out. Greg was already in his usual position, leaning forward, his posture designed to command the room. His voice filled the space as he briefed everyone on the background of the client, their preferences, their concerns, their demands. I was the last one to speak during these meetings, and I preferred it that way. I didn't need to be first. I needed to be heard. The door opened and the client walked in. His presence didn't demand attention. He wasn't the type to make a grand entrance. He simply entered the room with a quiet assurance that put everyone else on edge. He wasn't looking for the right suit, the right pitch, the right face. He was looking for something else entirely, something I wasn't sure I understood until I saw his eyes. They landed on me immediately. No hesitation, no quick glance away, as I had become so accustomed to. Just a direct look, one that didn't seem to ask for permission. I had seen it before, the way some people looked at me when they saw beyond the surface, when they saw through the expectations others placed on me. The difference was, this time, he didn't look away. He didn't shift his gaze toward Greg or anyone else in the room. He didn't flinch. He didn't seem worried that my appearance might disrupt whatever polished image he was expecting. Instead, he focused on me. Quietly, steadily. Greg began his spiel, talking about how we could deliver on the project, how our experience in the industry was unmatched. I couldn't help but notice the way the client's gaze never wavered from me. It was almost like he was listening to something deeper, something beyond the buzzwords and corporate jargon. I remained silent, allowing the words to float through the air. I wasn't trying to impress him. I wasn't trying to make him see me in a specific way. I was just letting the work speak for itself, just like I'd been doing all along. I had been in enough meetings to know that the ones who talk the loudest aren't always the ones who have the most to say. At some point, Greg stopped talking and the room shifted. It was as if the client had been waiting for this moment all along, for the right pause to fill the space with something that mattered. He turned to me, his eyes still locked on mine, and he asked the first real question of the day. "Tell me, Elijah," he began, his voice low but steady, "what makes this company different from the others we've worked with? I want to know. What sets you apart? Not the usual sales pitch. I'm here for something real." The words didn't sound rehearsed. They weren't part of any sales script. They were genuine. The kind of question you ask when you're not looking for a rehearsed answer, but the truth. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about the numbers or the details. This was about honesty. He wasn't here for a polished exterior or a shiny pitch. He was here for someone who could look beyond the surface, someone who wouldn't sell him a facade. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I had spent too many years hiding, too many years allowing others to dictate how I was perceived. But this was different. This man saw something in me that I had never expected anyone to see. "So," I answered simply, without embellishment, "we don't sell you a story. We deliver on what we promise. It's as simple as that." There was no grand gesture, no dramatic pause. It wasn't a pitch. It was a statement of fact. And, for the first time in my career, I didn't feel like I needed to explain my appearance, my past, or the things that made me different. I just let the words stand on their own. The client didn't respond immediately. He didn't smile. He didn't nod in agreement. He simply sat there, observing me with an intensity that felt both uncomfortable and strangely relieving. He looked at me as though the answer had satisfied him in a way that none of the polished presentations had. And when he finally did speak again, it wasn't to Greg, it was to me. "I like that," he said, his voice firm but unhurried. "That's what I need. Someone who's willing to be real, someone who doesn't hide behind a mask." For a second, the room seemed to still, the air thickening with the weight of his words. Everyone had expected him to be impressed by the usual corporate facade. They had expected him to pick the one who dressed the part, the one who spoke in jargon, the one who had the glossy exterior, but he didn't. He had picked the one who had simply been himself. As the meeting ended and the client shook hands with Greg, I could feel the shift. I could feel the change in the air. The client didn't need to say anything else. He didn't need to thank me or explain his decision. It was clear. I had earned his trust, not with my face, not with my skin, but with my honesty, with the way. I had answered without fear, without apology. And as the client left the room, I saw Greg out of the corner of my eye. He was standing by the door, his face unreadable, his mouth tight. He didn't know what had just happened. He didn't understand. But I did. It wasn't about fitting the image. It wasn't about looking the part. It was about showing up as who I was without pretending to be anything else. The client chose me. And now he was mine. Greg? He was still trying to figure out how to fill the empty space in the room. The contract came in early one morning. It was already signed, finalized, the details ironed out in neat, precise language, like everything in business should be. I opened the email, the PDF attached, and scrolled through it quickly. There were no surprises, no changes to the numbers, no last-minute adjustments. The terms were exactly as we had discussed during the meeting, and I had expected that. But as I reached the signature section, I noticed something. My name wasn't there. It wasn't a small oversight. It wasn't a typo. It was deliberate. Greg's name appeared in the spot where mine should have been. He was the one who had signed it. The client's signature was there too, right beneath his, indicating approval. But there was no mention of me, no acknowledgement of the role I played in bringing the deal to life. The client had chosen me, and yet Greg had claimed the credit. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. I wasn't angry, at least, not in the way I expected to feel. It was more a strange, quiet frustration that settled somewhere deep in my chest. Greg had once again made himself the center of the story, and in doing so, he had erased me from it. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed, not in the client, not even in Greg, just in the reality that, despite everything, the world still preferred the illusion over the truth. It was easier for them to credit the face they knew, the name they recognized, than to give any value to the work that had been done quietly, without fanfare. I closed the email and pushed the screen away. From me, I didn't need to see the document again. I knew what it said. I knew what it didn't say. I had been part of the project from the start, writing, designing, strategizing, but the contract was now a symbol of how easy it was for the world to pass over someone like me. The thought lingered for a while, but I pushed it out. It wasn't time for self-pity. It was time for something else. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and left the office early. I didn't want to sit around feeling bitter about what I had just seen. It wasn't about the contract. It was about the fact that I was still letting Greg's actions define me. I had spent so long proving that I could be as competent as anyone else, and now I was letting his need for recognition overshadow everything I had done. I had been so focused on him, on his approval, that I had forgotten the most important part. The client had chosen me. The client saw through everything Greg had tried to manipulate. As I walked out into the cool evening air, the weight of the day lifted a little. I wasn't going to let Greg steal my thunder anymore. He could have his name on the contract. He could take the credit for the deal, but the truth was, the work was still mine. The results were still mine. The client's trust was still mine. That was what mattered. Not the title, not the signature, just the work. The next morning, I came in early again. I didn't bring up the contract to Greg. I didn't mention it to anyone. But I started working on the next project, the next pitch. I kept my focus on what I could control. I didn't need to ask for validation. I didn't need anyone to give me a pat on the back. The numbers spoke for themselves. The quality of the work spoke for itself. Later that week, I got a call from the client, the one who had chosen me. He wanted to meet again, to discuss a larger project. He said he was impressed with my attention to detail, my ability to communicate, my ability to get results. His words weren't just a compliment. They were validation. And in that moment, I realized something important. The client didn't care who signed the contract. He didn't care about the names on paper. He cared about what had been delivered. He cared about the work, the results, the honesty. And that was the moment I knew that, no matter what Greg did, no matter how many contracts he signed with his name, I had already won. I had earned the trust of the client. I had earned something far more valuable than a name on a contract. I had earned the respect of the one person who mattered, the one who looked beyond the surface, beyond the image, beyond the names. I didn't need the contract to prove that. I didn't need anyone else to validate me. I had already done the work, and in the end, that was all that mattered. When I met with the client again, it wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. There were no power plays, no surface-level pleasantries, just an honest conversation about the next steps, about what he needed, about what I could offer. He didn't hesitate when he looked at me. He didn't flinch at my face. He looked straight at me like he saw the person, not the appearance. And that was more than I'd ever gotten from anyone in that room. It wasn't about what Greg had done. It was about what I had done. The contract, the signatures, the titles, they were irrelevant now. What mattered was the work I had done, the trust I had earned, and the path I was creating on my own. No more waiting for recognition. No more hoping that someone would see me for who I really was. I had already made my mark, and it wasn't in the ink on paper. It was in the work. It was in the results. It was in the respect I had earned, not through appearances, but through my commitment to delivering on my word. And that, in the end, was all I would ever need. The EEO office felt different now. It wasn't just the space or the layout, though those things had shifted subtly. It was the atmosphere, the way the room breathed now as if it had been waiting for someone to step into it. It wasn't mine because I had signed a lease or filled out a form. It was mine because I had built it with my work, my effort, my persistence. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to claim it. I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me permission to be here. The windows were larger than I remembered, the city stretching beyond the glass like an unspoken promise of everything. That was out there, just beyond reach, but now it felt close, closer than it ever had. I sat behind the desk, the same desk Greg had once used, the same desk where he had made every decision about who was worthy of success and who was invisible. But it wasn't just about sitting here now. It was about the space I'd carved for myself. The work had gotten me here, not the way I looked, not the face I showed to the world. It was the results, the quiet consistency, the commitment to being more than just a figure in the background. I didn't bring any personal items into the office. No photos, no knickknacks. I didn't need them. This place didn't need decoration. It didn't need distractions. I had spent so many years hiding, keeping to the shadows, shrinking back, that now the simplicity of the space felt like a declaration. I wasn't here to fit into the mold. I wasn't here to be noticed or praised for what I looked like. I was here to do the work, to let the results speak, to let the numbers add up on their own. The door opened, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, I didn't flinch. I didn't expect to see Greg, but it was him standing there looking uncertain. He hesitated in the doorway, the faintest trace of something unfamiliar in his eyes, something that I couldn't quite name. For a second, it almost felt like a throwback, like we were in the same place we had been weeks ago. But it wasn't the same anymore. I wasn't the same. He stood there awkwardly, still in his crisp suit, still trying to look the part, but there was something off now. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way he couldn't figure out where he stood anymore. He had always been the one to dictate terms, to set expectations. Now, it seemed like he was waiting for me to say something, to validate him in some way, but I didn't need to. The work had already validated me. The clients had validated me. And in this space, that was all that mattered. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded without saying a word. He walked in and stood on the opposite side of the desk, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. He didn't sit down, as though afraid to settle into a space he no longer controlled. I didn't offer him a chair. I didn't need to. "I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice now a little softer, almost unsure. "See how you're settling in?" I didn't respond at first. I simply looked at him, watching him try to navigate this new dynamic. It was a strange feeling, seeing him like this, off balance, out of his element. He had always been the one in control, the one making decisions, the one steering the ship. But now there was nothing left to steer. His hands, once so steady, fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve. I didn't know what he expected from me. Apology? Sympathy? I wasn't interested in offering either. "Everything's going well," I said quietly, my voice steady. "The projects are moving forward. Clients are happy." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a challenge. It was simply the truth. The work spoke for itself now, louder than any words could. Greg looked away for a moment, like he didn't want to admit it, like he wasn't ready to face the reality that things had shifted, that he had been pushed aside without anyone even asking for his opinion. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped. His gaze flickered to the door, to the space around us, to the desk between us. And in that brief moment, I saw the weight of what he had failed to recognize, what he had failed to value. He didn't know how to navigate this space anymore. He didn't know how to claim authority in a room that had already been claimed by the truth of the work. "I never thought you would—" He trailed off, the words unsure. "I didn't think you'd want it. I thought—" You thought what? I interrupted, cutting him off. There was no point in letting him finish the sentence. It didn't matter anymore. I had learned long ago that the opinions of men like Greg were nothing but distractions. He looked at me, his lips tight, but the anger had faded, replaced by something closer to confusion. Maybe regret. Maybe just disbelief that I hadn't taken the path he expected. I wasn't the obedient one anymore. I wasn't the one who sat in the back and waited for a turn. I was the one in charge now, and I wasn't looking for his approval. You thought I'd be like everyone else, I said, my voice calm, almost distant. You thought my face would be an obstacle, that it would stop me. But I've done the work, and I'll keep doing it. I don't need anyone's validation, not yours, not anyone's. Greg stayed silent for a moment, the words weighing heavy in the air between us. The room felt colder now, the silence pressing down on both of us. No, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have seen it sooner. But he didn't finish. The apology was never fully spoken. It didn't matter. I wasn't waiting for it anymore. I didn't need it. He stood there for a moment longer, his hand still fumbling with his cuff. I didn't offer to shake his hand. I didn't offer anything at all. Instead, I simply turned, my attention back to the screen in front of me, signaling that the conversation was over. Without another word, he turned and left, walking out of the office the same way he had walked in, uncertain, unsure of where he stood, of what was left. For him to claim, I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. The room felt even quieter after he was gone. It was my space now, my place, and the work would continue, whether Greg was there to witness it or not. I didn't need mirrors anymore. I didn't need reflection. The only thing I needed was the work in front of me. And that was enough.